"You don't belong here," Edward Whitmore said, his voice cutting clean through the low hum of conversations and clinking glasses. And just like that, the entire restaurant seemed to freeze as if someone had turned down the volume on the world. Naomi Carter stood there in her pressed black uniform, a tray balanced lightly in her hand, the soft glow of pendant lights reflecting off polished marble and crystal. Her name tag catching a thin line of gold light across her chest, but her expression didn't break, didn't even flicker, not when a few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats or when the manager hesitated 3 steps away, unsure whether to step in or step back. Edward leaned into his chair, expensive watch glinting under the chandelier, his posture relaxed in the way only someone used to control could be, his eyes scanning Naomi like she was a mistake that needed correcting, like she was out of place in a room built on money and quiet power. The air felt tighter now, heavier, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, waiting for something to snap. But Naomi simply lowered the tray onto the edge of the table with careful precision, the glassware barely making a sound as it settled, her movements measured, deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. Somewhere behind the bar, a receipt printer whirred softly, unnoticed by most, but Naomi's eyes flicked there for just a second, sharp, aware, before returning to Edward, not challenging, not submissive, just steady, like she was seeing something no one else in the room could. "I asked for someone competent," Edward continued, his tone smooth, almost bored, but loud enough that every nearby table leaned into the moment whether they wanted to or not, and a faint ripple of nervous laughter passed through a group by the window, quickly dying when Naomi didn't react. She didn't apologize, didn't rush, didn't shrink. Instead, she reached for the handheld terminal at her side, her fingers moving quickly, almost invisibly, correcting a line item, adjusting a number that had been quietly off all evening, something buried deep in the system, something costing the restaurant more than anyone realized. But no one noticed, no one except her. The manager finally stepped closer, clearing his throat, tension written across his face. But before he could speak, Edward raised a hand without even looking at him, dismissing him like background noise, his focus locked on Naomi, expecting something, a reaction, an apology, anything that would confirm what he already believed. But Naomi just stood there, breathing evenly, the soft rise and fall of her shoulders barely visible, the faint scent of citrus, cleaner and fresh linen lingering in the air around her. And in that stillness, something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like the moment before a storm changes direction. Edward didn't see it. Not yet. He only saw a waitress who didn't respond the way she was supposed to. And that, more than anything, seemed to irritate him, his jaw tightening slightly as he leaned forward, ready to push further, unaware that the room he thought he controlled was already beginning to move in a direction he hadn't planned, and Naomi, still silent, already knew exactly how this moment would end. Naomi Carter had only been working the evening floor for 3 weeks, but she moved through the restaurant like someone who had memorized every inch of it long before she ever wore the uniform. Her steps measured to the exact spacing between tables, her timing aligned with the rhythm of the kitchen doors swinging open and closed, the soft hiss of steam from the espresso machine, the muted conversations, layered like background music. She knew which tables preferred silence, which ones needed reassurance, which guests would tip generously, and which ones would not even look her in the eye. And yet she treated every one of them the same, with a quiet steadiness that never begged for approval. Earlier that evening, before the rush had filled every seat, she had paused near the service station, her gaze resting briefly on the main dining room as sunlight faded through the tall glass windows, casting long reflections across the polished floor. And for a moment, she had simply observed, not as a server rushing into a shift, but as someone taking inventory of something far more intricate, something layered. Beneath the surface, the system behind the bar had been glitching all night, small inconsistencies buried deep in the numbers, a misplaced decimal here, a duplicated charge there, subtle enough to pass unnoticed by most. But Naomi had caught it within minutes, her fingers adjusting entries with quiet precision whenever she passed the terminal, correcting errors without drawing attention, as if she were smoothing invisible wrinkles no one else could see. The other staff had noticed her calm, the She never panicked, even when orders stacked up and voices overlapped. But they assumed it was just experience, just another worker trying to get through a shift. None of them knew that Naomi had once managed something far more complex than a dinner rush, that her silence was not hesitation but control, that every movement she made was intentional. When the manager had first hired her, he had barely looked at her resume, more concerned with filling a gap in the schedule than understanding who she was. And Naomi had not corrected him, had not offered more than what was asked, because she did not need recognition to do what needed to be done. Now, standing in front of Edward Whitmore, with the weight of his words still hanging in the air, she felt the room watching her, waiting for her to respond in a way that fit their expectations, to apologize, to shrink, to confirm the role they had already assigned to her. But Naomi's attention shifted again, just for a second, to the terminal behind the bar, where the corrected numbers had already begun to stabilize the system, where the quiet work she had done was already changing the outcome of the night in ways no one else would notice until it was too late. She returned her gaze to Edward, not with defiance, not with submission, but with something far more unsettling, a calm that did not match the situation, a stillness that suggested she was not reacting because she did not need to. And in that moment, as the tension stretched tighter across the room, it became clear that Naomi Carter was not simply enduring the situation, she was allowing it to unfold, as if she already understood every step that would come next and had decided, long before this night began, exactly how far she was willing to let it go. Edward Whitmore had built his reputation on control, and everything about the restaurant reflected that expectation, from the precise spacing between tables to the synchronized movement of staff who knew better than to disrupt the atmosphere he valued. A flagship location he was quietly preparing to acquire, a final piece in a portfolio that already stretched across cities and industries. To him, this place was not just a restaurant, it was a calculated investment, a brand with influence, a system he intended to reshape and scale. And tonight was supposed to confirm what he already believed, that it was ready to be absorbed into something bigger under his direction. He had spent the last hour evaluating everything with a critical eye, noting minor inefficiencies, small delays in service, the kind of details he would later use to justify restructuring, his mind already moving ahead to contracts, leadership changes, projected margins. But now his focus had narrowed entirely onto Naomi Carter, because she did not fit into his model. She did not react the way variables were supposed to react, and that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Around him, the room remained suspended in a quiet tension, guests pretending to return to their meals while still listening, staff moving carefully, aware that something had shifted but unsure how to correct it. The manager stood a few feet away, his posture rigid, caught between protecting the image of the restaurant and appeasing a man whose name alone could influence its future, his hands clasped too tightly, his voice trapped somewhere behind hesitation. Edward leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, his patience thinning, because in his world, hesitation was weakness and silence was either submission or defiance, and he was determined to force a response that would restore the balance he expected. Yet Naomi remained still, her presence almost understated against the polished backdrop, her gaze steady, not fixed on him in challenge, but not avoiding him either, as if she understood the entire equation unfolding in front of her and saw no urgency to interrupt it. Behind the bar, the system continued to stabilize, numbers aligning, discrepancies disappearing one by one, the quiet correction of a flaw that would have gone unnoticed until it became a problem far larger than a single evening service, and still no one connected it to her. Edward glanced briefly toward the manager, then back to Naomi, his expression tightening just enough to reveal the shift beneath his composed exterior, because something about this moment was no longer following the script he had written in his mind, and for the first time that evening, there was a faint crack in his certainty. He was used to environments bending to his presence, to people adjusting without being asked, to outcomes aligning with his expectations before he even voiced them. But here, in this carefully curated space, a single variable refused to behave, and that refusal was beginning to ripple outward, subtle but undeniable. Naomi's hand rested lightly against the edge of the counter now, her fingers relaxed, her breathing even, and in the reflection of the glass behind her, the room looked different, not frozen, but waiting, as if every person there sensed that the moment had not yet reached its conclusion, that something unseen was already in motion, something that would not only shift the dynamic of this conversation, but redefine it entirely. And Naomi, without raising her voice or changing her posture, was standing at the exact center of it all. Allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for the truth to approach on its own terms, Edward Whitmore leaned forward slowly, his fingers resting against the edge of the table as if grounding himself in something solid, something familiar, but the certainty that had filled him just minutes ago no longer held the same weight. "Manager," he said, his voice measured but edged with impatience, "if this is your standard of service, I can assure you this place will not survive under proper ownership." And the words carried just far enough to reach the surrounding tables, pulling attention back into the moment like a tide returning. The manager stepped closer, his expression tight, nodding too quickly, apologizing under his breath, already preparing to correct what he assumed was a simple problem, a single employee out of line, something that could be fixed with a quiet dismissal and a promise to do better. But Naomi did not move, did not step back or speak over him. She simply reached once more for the handheld terminal, her thumb brushing across the screen in a smooth motion, confirming the final adjustments she had made to the system, the corrected totals now flowing seamlessly through the network, invisible to everyone except the one person who had taken the time to notice. A server passed behind her carrying a tray of drinks, the faint scent of citrus and ice trailing through the air, while somewhere in the kitchen a bell chimed twice, signaling another order ready. The rhythm of the restaurant trying to resume, to pull itself back into normalcy, but the tension refused to dissolve. Edward watched her now with sharper focus, his eyes narrowing slightly, because her composure no longer read as compliance. It felt deliberate, like she was choosing silence rather than defaulting to it, and that distinction unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. "I am speaking to you," he added, quieter this time, but with more force beneath it, the kind that expected immediate acknowledgement, expected alignment, expected the world to respond. Naomi lifted her gaze to meet his, calm and unwavering, and for a brief second the noise of the room seemed to recede again, not into silence, but into something more controlled, like a held breath. She did not apologize, did not defend herself. Instead, she reached up and unpinned her name tag with a small, precise motion, the metal catching the light as it came free, and placed it gently on the counter beside her. The soft click it made against the surface somehow louder than it should have been. The manager's eyes widened slightly, confusion flickering across his face as he took a step forward, unsure whether this meant resignation or something else entirely, while Edward's expression shifted, just enough to reveal that he had not expected this outcome, that the script he had been following no longer applied. Naomi rested her hands lightly at her sides, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, as if removing the name tag had not altered anything about her presence in the room, as if it had simply clarified something that had already been true. Across the dining room, a couple paused mid-conversation, a fork hovering just above a plate, while a man near the bar lowered his glass slowly, all of them sensing that the moment had crossed an invisible line, that whatever was about to happen next would not follow the usual pattern of complaint and correction. Edward straightened slightly in his chair, his gaze fixed on Naomi, searching for something he could reassert control over, but finding nothing that behaved the way he expected. And in that growing space between expectation and reality, something unfamiliar began to settle, not yet recognition, not yet understanding, but the first quiet hint that the situation he believed he commanded was no longer entirely his to shape. The manager finally stepped in fully, his voice low but urgent. "Naomi, I need you to step away for a moment." But the words lacked authority, more request than command, and it showed in the way his hands hovered uncertainly at his sides. Naomi did not resist, but she did not rush either, taking one small step back from the table, enough to acknowledge him without surrendering the quiet control she held over herself. And that subtle difference did not go unnoticed by Edward Whitmore, whose gaze sharpened as he watched the interaction unfold. "This is exactly what I mean," Edward said, gesturing lightly toward her, his tone now directed at the manager but clearly meant for the room. "No structure, no accountability, no understanding of standards. Each word landing with calculated precision, reinforcing the imbalance he believed defined the situation. A few guests nodded faintly, others looked down, unwilling to be part of it, while the staff exchanged brief glances that carried more tension than words could. The manager swallowed, forcing a tight smile. "Sir, I assure you this will be handled." And he turned slightly toward Naomi, lowering his voice further. "Please, just give me a minute." But Naomi's expression remained unchanged, calm, composed, as if the outcome of this conversation had already been decided somewhere beyond the visible moment. Edward leaned back again, but this time there was a trace of impatience beneath the surface, a tightening at the corners of his eyes, because the resolution he expected was not arriving fast enough, not clean enough, and that delay began to feel like resistance. "Handled," he repeated quietly, almost to himself, then louder. "If you cannot maintain basic standards in your own establishment, perhaps it is time someone else does." And the implication hung heavy in the air, not just a criticism but a claim, a declaration of intent that this place, this carefully balanced environment, was already being measured for replacement. The manager's posture stiffened, a flicker of concern crossing his face, because this was no longer just about one employee. It was about the future of the entire restaurant, and yet he still could not fully explain why Naomi's presence made the situation feel more complicated than it should have been. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, her hand brushing the edge of the counter again, not nervously but thoughtfully, her eyes moving once more toward the bar where the system now ran smoothly. The earlier inconsistencies completely resolved, the quiet work finished, and still unrecognized. A server approached hesitantly, whispering something to the manager about orders being back on track, about the system suddenly correcting itself, and the manager blinked, confused, glancing toward the terminal as if trying to reconcile the timing. But he had no answer, no clear link to the woman standing just a few feet away. Edward noticed the exchange, the brief distraction, and his focus shifted again, his attention drawn not just to Naomi, but to the subtle changes happening around her. The way the environment was stabilizing even as the tension remained. And for the first time there was a crack in his assumption that he understood everything happening in the room. Naomi lifted her gaze again, meeting his for a second time, and this time there was something different in it, not challenge, not submission, but clarity, a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken, and it lingered just long enough to register before she looked away, as if giving him the space to arrive at something on his own. The manager opened his mouth to speak again, to finalize the decision he believed he needed to make, but the words did not come as easily as before, because the situation no longer felt simple, no longer felt like a mistake that could be corrected with a single action, and in that hesitation, the balance of the moment shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as if the control Edward had been asserting from the beginning was beginning to loosen, not through confrontation, but through something far quieter, far more precise, something that Naomi Carter had already set in motion long before anyone realized it. The room did not explode. It did not collapse into chaos. Instead, it settled into something far more uncomfortable, a quiet that stretched thin across every table, every glass, every breath, as if the entire space was holding itself still to see what would happen next. Naomi Carter stood with her hands relaxed at her sides, the absence of her name tag now more noticeable than anything she had said, the small empty space on her uniform catching the soft light in a way that drew the eye without demanding attention. And for the first time since the moment began, no one spoke, not the manager, not Edward Whitmore, not even the guests who had been whispering just moments ago. Somewhere near the back, a chair shifted slightly, the faint scrape against the floor echoing more than it should have, and then silence returned again, deeper this time, more deliberate. Naomi inhaled slowly, the breath subtle, controlled, her shoulders rising just enough to mark the motion, and when she exhaled, it seemed to release something into the room, not tension exactly, but a pause, a space where everything that had been said could settle. Edward watched her closely now, not with the same dismissive certainty as before, but with a growing awareness that he had misread something fundamental, though he could not yet define what it was. His fingers tapped once against the table, then stopped, the motion incomplete, as if even he was unsure what action should follow. The manager glanced between them, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet confusion, because the situation no longer followed the expected path of correction and resolution. It had become something else entirely, something that required understanding rather than authority, and he did not have that understanding. Behind the bar, the lights reflected cleanly off the glassware, the system running without error. Now, orders flowing smoothly, the earlier inconsistencies gone as if they had never existed, and a bartender glanced at the screen with a small frown, noticing the change but not questioning it aloud. Naomi's gaze drifted briefly across the room, not searching, not avoiding, simply observing, taking in the subtle shifts in posture, the way people leaned slightly forward, the way conversations had not yet resumed. As if everyone sensed that the moment had not reached its conclusion, she did not rush to leave, did not speak to defend herself. Instead, she allowed the silence to expand, to do what words often could not, revealing more with each passing second than any explanation might. Edward straightened in his chair, his expression tightening again, but this time it was not irritation that defined it. It was uncertainty, a subtle but unmistakable shift, because he was no longer reacting to a situation he controlled. He was reacting to one he did not fully understand, the weight of. That realization settled slowly, like a shadow moving across the floor, unnoticed until it covered more than expected. Naomi turned slightly then, not away from him, but enough to break the direct line between them, her movement calm, unhurried, as if she were preparing to step out of the moment entirely. And in that simple shift, the balance changed again, because now it felt as though the decision of what happened next no longer belonged to the man who had demanded control, but to the woman who had never asked for it. And the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, waiting, on the edge of revealing something that had been there all along, just beneath the surface, unseen until now. The sound of the front door opening did not seem loud at first, just a soft shift in air, a subtle break in the sealed atmosphere of the dining room. But it was enough to draw a few glances toward the entrance, enough to ripple through the silence that had settled too deeply to ignore. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped inside with purpose, his pace controlled but urgent, a leather folder tucked under his arm, his eyes scanning the room not as a guest, but as someone looking for a specific point in a carefully unfolding situation. He moved past the host's stand without hesitation, his shoes making quiet, deliberate contact with the polished floor, each step measured, each movement precise, until he reached the edge of the dining area where Edward Whitmore sat, still caught between certainty and something he had not yet named. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said, his voice low but clear, carrying just enough authority to shift attention without raising it, and Edward turned. Irritation flickering first before recognition tried to follow, though it arrived a moment too late. The man leaned in slightly, opening the folder with practiced ease, his voice dropping just enough that only Edward could hear, but the effect was immediate, visible in the way Edward's posture changed, in the way his hand, resting on the table, stilled completely. The words were not loud, not dramatic, but they landed with precision. "The acquisition has been halted." A brief pause, a page turned. "The ownership structure is not as previously disclosed." And then, quieter still, almost a confirmation rather than a revelation. "Naomi Carter holds controlling interest across the entire chain." The silence that followed did not belong to the room anymore. It belonged to Edward, to the space inside him where certainty had just been replaced by something else entirely. His eyes lifted slowly, not with the sharp command they carried before, but with something slower, heavier, as they found Naomi again, standing exactly where she had been, unchanged, as if nothing had shifted at all. Around them, the restaurant seemed to exhale without realizing it. A few conversations cautiously restarting, a glass being lifted, a chair adjusted, but the center of the moment remained fixed, unmoved. The manager stared, confusion giving way to realization in fragments, his gaze moving from the man with the folder to Naomi and back again, as if trying to assemble a truth that had been present the entire time but hidden in plain sight. Naomi did not step forward, did not speak. She simply met Edward's eyes for a brief moment, and in that look there was no triumph, No need to assert what had just been revealed, only a quiet clarity, the same steady presence she had held from the beginning. Edward's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the effort to process, to reconcile the version of reality he had been operating within with the one now unfolding in front of him. And for the first time that evening, he did not reach for control, he did not interrupt, he did not correct, because there was nothing left to correct. The man with the folder stepped back, closing it with a soft click, his role complete, the information delivered, and as he moved aside, the space between Edward and Naomi felt different now, not defined by imbalance, but by something far more fragile. The moment after a truth is seen but not yet understood, Naomi shifted slightly, turning her body just enough toward the exit, her movement unhurried, almost gentle, as if she were stepping out of a scene that no longer required her presence, leaving behind a silence that carried far more weight than any words could have. And Edward Whitmore, sitting there beneath the soft glow of the chandelier, realized with quiet certainty that the moment he believed he controlled had never truly belonged to him at all. Edward Whitmore did not stand immediately, and that hesitation alone felt louder than anything he had said before. His body still angled toward the table, but his attention no longer anchored there, no longer fixed on control or evaluation, instead caught somewhere between realization and something heavier, something closer to reflection. His fingers, which had once tapped with quiet impatience, now rested motionless against the polished surface, the reflection of the overhead light faintly trembling across his watch face, as if even the smallest details had begun to feel different. Naomi Carter had already taken a step toward the exit, not hurried, not dramatic, just a natural continuation of motion, as though the moment behind her had completed its purpose, and there was nothing left for her to claim or prove. The manager remained frozen where he stood, his mind still catching up, his understanding arriving in fragments, the pieces aligning too late to change what had already unfolded, and he glanced toward Edward as if expecting some directive, some command that would restore order, but none came. Edward's gaze followed Naomi now, not with authority, not with expectation, but with a quiet urgency he did not yet fully recognize. And after a brief pause that stretched just long enough to feel intentional, he pushed his chair back, the soft scrape against the floor cutting through the room in a way that drew attention without demanding it. He stood, straightening his jacket automatically, a reflex from years of maintaining composure. But there was a difference now, something less certain beneath the surface, something that did not quite align with the image he had carried into the room. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice measured, controlled, but lacking the sharp edge it had held before, and the words reached her just as she neared the edge of the dining area. Naomi paused, not immediately turning, allowing a brief moment to pass, a quiet space where the weight of what had already happened could settle more fully. And then she looked back, her expression unchanged, calm, attentive, but distant in a way that suggested she was no longer part of the dynamic that had defined the earlier exchange. Edward took a step forward, then another, closing the distance slightly, though not enough to impose, not enough to reclaim anything, just enough to be heard without raising his voice. "I was not aware," he began, and the sentence lingered there for a moment, incomplete, as if he were choosing each word with more care than he was used to, "of your position." And even as he said it, the explanation felt insufficient, too narrow to contain the broader truth of what had just been revealed. Naomi held his gaze, listening, not interrupting, not dismissing, simply allowing him to continue if he chose to, but offering nothing to guide him, nothing to soften the space he now had to navigate on his own. Edward exhaled quietly, the breath subtle but visible in the slight shift of his shoulders, and for a brief second, the composure he had relied on seemed to loosen, just enough to reveal the effort behind it. "I misjudged the situation," he added, the words more direct this time, though still controlled, still measured, as if he were acknowledging something without fully stepping into it. The room around them had resumed its movement, but more cautiously now, conversations quieter, glances lingering a second longer than usual, the awareness of what had transpired still present beneath the surface. Naomi's posture remained steady, her hands relaxed, her presence unchanged by his words. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, even, carrying only as far as it needed to. "You did not misjudge the situation," she said, and there was no accusation in her tone, no sharpness, only clarity. "You judged what you chose to see." And the sentence settled between them with a quiet finality that did not demand a response. Edward's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show that the words had landed somewhere deeper than the moment itself, somewhere that would not be easily dismissed or corrected. Naomi gave a slight nod, not as acknowledgement of him, but as closure of the interaction, and then she turned back toward the exit, her steps as measured as before, leaving behind a space that felt altered, not by confrontation, but by understanding. And Edward Whitmore stood there for a moment longer, the weight of what had been said settling in fully for the first time, realizing that the power he had carried into the room had not been taken from him. It had simply been shown to be something different than he had believed. All along, the door closed behind Naomi Carter with a soft, almost weightless sound, the kind that did not demand attention, yet somehow marked the end of something that could not be undone. And for a moment Edward Whitmore remained where he stood, his gaze fixed on the space she had just left, as if expecting something to follow, some final shift that would return the world to its previous order. But nothing came. The restaurant continued around him, subdued but steady, glasses lifted, quiet conversations resuming, the rhythm of service finding its way back into place. Yet everything felt slightly altered, as though the room itself had absorbed what had happened and would not easily forget it. Edward lowered himself back into his chair slowly, not with the confidence he had carried earlier, but with a measured awareness of the movement, as if even sitting required more thought now, his hand resting on the table where the reflection of the overhead light no longer seemed as sharp. Across the room, the manager began speaking quietly with staff, his tone careful, his posture different, more attentive, as if he were seeing the environment he managed with new eyes, noticing details he had overlooked before. Near the bar, the system screen glowed steadily, the numbers aligned, the earlier inconsistencies gone without explanation, and a bartender glanced at it once more before returning to work, unaware of the quiet intervention that had changed the outcome of the entire evening. Edward exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, and for the first time that night, there was no urgency in his expression, no immediate plan forming behind his eyes, only a quiet stillness, the kind that follows when certainty has been replaced by something more complex. He reached for the glass in front of him but paused before lifting it, his reflection faintly visible in the surface, not distorted, but different, as if he were seeing himself from a distance rather than from within. The words Naomi had spoken lingered, not loud, not repeating, but present, settling into a place that did not allow for easy dismissal. And he realized, not all at once, but gradually, that the moment had not been about a single interaction, not about service or standards or control, but about something far more fundamental, something he had moved through for years without questioning. Around him, the soft glow of the lights reflected off polished surfaces, creating a calm that contrasted with the tension that had filled the room earlier. And yet that calm did not erase what had happened, it simply held it in place, allowing it to exist without noise. Edward set the glass back down untouched, his hand resting beside it, still, and in that stillness there was no attempt to reclaim authority, no effort to rewrite the moment, only the quiet recognition that some things could not be undone, only understood. Outside, through the tall glass windows, the city moved as it always did, headlights passing, distant motion continuing without pause, indifferent to what had taken place inside. And Naomi Carter was already part of that movement now.